Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groß, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Grace Blakeley in today's episode. She is an economist, staff writer at Tribune magazine, podcaster, and author of several books, including her newest work, Vulture, Capitalism, Corporate Crimes, Backdoor Bailouts, and the Death of Freedom. Before we start, a quick announcement. Together with my favorite programmer, Thomas Ries, I built the Democratic Planning Research Platform, which is now live under planningresearch.net. You can find the link in the show notes as well. And as the name kind of gives away, this platform is a resource designed to help you with your research on democratic planning. It's free for everybody to use, so head over and take a look, planningresearch.net. And now, please enjoy today's episode with Grace Blakeley on capitalist planning and its alternatives. Welcome, Grace.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Grace, I'd like to talk to you about capitalist planning and its alternatives, namely democratic planning. In contrast to liberal free market myths, you state that we are essentially living in a capitalist planned economy. We'll get to the narrative aspect of this later, but first, what are the ways in which capitalist planning takes place?
Yeah, so this is really the central thesis of my latest book, Vulture, Capitalism. And I really wanted to kind of push back against this narrative that we've seen particularly strongly since the 1980s, and especially in countries like the US and the UK, which is this idea that we live in these kind of free market societies, and that the reforms that were introduced in the US and the UK in the 1980s, so things like privatization, changes in regulation, lower taxation, particularly lower taxation of big businesses, that all of these equated to a kind of more free market economy. And this way of thinking stems from the idea that you can basically divide economies into free market capitalist ones on the one hand, and then centrally planned state socialist ones on the other hand. And my argument in Vulture Capitalism is actually that actually existing capitalism is based on a kind of fusion between markets and planning. And on this spectrum between kind of centralized state planning and a fully decentralized market system, all capitalist societies fall somewhere along this spectrum, just as all kind of, state socialist societies do as well. The US and China today both have in common that they are economies that combine elements of centralized planning, of centralized state planning and corporate planning with kind of markets in certain areas of society as well. And the reason I wanted to make this point is because it's really important, I think, to clarify what capitalism actually is in order to understand as well what a kind of transition to socialism would look like. Because often on the left, we kind of fall into this trap of basically, the trap that the right has set, which is to say that anything the state does is socialism. And when you kind of have a smaller state, in inverted commas, that means that you have more markets and more capitalism and therefore less socialism. And if you have a bigger state, that means that you have more socialism and less capitalism. And what I wanted to show is that, in capitalist societies, there is a substantial amount of fusion between public and private interests. And that kind of fusion of interests is deployed to undertake certain amounts of planning in the interests of people at the top of society. So, some examples I use are governments intervening in the economy in service of their businesses, so to kind of prop up the interests of large multinational corporations that are headquartered in their economy, changing regulation, not necessarily to reduce regulation, but to make that regulation more permissive and often more profitable for big businesses, because there are a lot of businesses that exploit regulatory arbitrage basically to generate profits. And that the tax system, the existence of various forms of subsidies, all of these things are policies that are deployed by the state often to serve the interests of capital. And that equally, big businesses are also substantially able to plan what takes place within the economy on their own account, because we don't live in these kind of decentralized free market systems. Instead, we have, quite monopolized markets, both across the global economy and in certain national economies as well. And that market power allows big businesses to make active decisions about who gets what, rather than simply responding to market pressure. So all of this means that you have a small number of powerful institutions and individuals running those institutions who are able to make active decisions about production, about the allocation of resources, i.e. they're able to plan what takes place in the economy and society, even though we're supposed to live in a kind of free market system where nobody really has the power to plan what happens. And so the opposite of that in my book is not, as people who say, for example, that socialism means just the state nationalizing everything. The inverse of that system of kind of capitalist oligarchic planning is not just state control. It's actually the decentralization of power across the whole of society. So it means, democratic worker control of big businesses. It means a much more accountable and democratic state. It means the democratization of finance, of international institutions. Effectively, I argue that capitalism is a system based on domination, control, rigid hierarchies. And that the opposite of that system is one based on kind of collective power and solidarity.
I would be interested in digging a little bit deeper into the theoretical side of stating that we are living in a capitalist planned economy, so to speak. You give different examples, and some of them you already stated, but specifically you give examples that regard Amazon and the way in which it kind of tries to escape market forces. Maybe not really escape, but control market forces, I would say, because that kind of seems to be the goal of the whole operation, you say. There's a quote in which you state that Amazon is really trying to gain sovereignty in order to, quote, plan without pressure from the market. And then a few sentences later, you say, market power is precisely the power to avoid the pressures imposed by the market. It is the power to control the market rather than to be controlled by it, end quote. Could you maybe untangle this relation a bit more, the relation between market forces, market power, and how it relates to political power as well?
Yeah, that's a really important point. And it's worth kind of sketching out the background to this understanding. And basically, if you look at any kind of mainstream economics textbook or just any kind of introduction to economics, then a market system will be described as one in which there is a kind of decentralized process for the production and allocation of resources, and the kind of the magic of the market, I suppose, is the way in which prices can emerge from the interaction of lots of different agents throughout the whole economy who aren't often in direct contact with one another, but who are simply responding to market signals. So, for example, you have like a couple of different businesses all producing cars, let's say, or a widget or whatever. Business A produces, a certain number at a certain price. Business B produces a different number at a different price. And then they'll all put their cars on the market, and whichever firm is more profitable will, basically survive. And that will be an indication that their pricing strategy and their production strategy was the most effective one. So the market kind of reveals the level at which you're supposed to produce. It reveals the price at which you're supposed to, sell a good. And in doing so, it ensures that we have this kind of equilibration of supply and demand across the whole economy. And that was the kind of magic of the market as described by early political economists like Adam Smith, for example. And, that's still kind of the justification that a lot of people on the right use for capitalist systems today. The idea is that a capitalist system is a market system, and it is therefore, it provides them a very efficient set of, rules and institutions through which we're able to produce and allocate resources very effectively, very efficiently, and that, whilst capitalism may kind of create problems in other areas of the economy, the fact that it's so efficient means that any other system would be worse, because so many resources would be wasted, because we wouldn't have this magical market mechanism that was doing all this work of kind of equilibrating supply and demand, basically. Now, there are kind of issues that you can take with that argument. But for me, in this book, I was basically saying that capitalism isn't actually a market system. So there are obviously markets within capitalism. But firstly, those markets are created politically through, government intervention, for example. So the context for market interaction requires laws, regulation, money. All of these things are kind of political constructs that are kind of created and enforced by governments, working with one another. And that those governments tend to actually generate and impose those laws based on the balance of power within society. So it doesn't, governments aren't just standing back and creating neutral regulations that are supposed to kind of promote free markets. What they're doing is creating laws and regulations and tax policy, all different kinds of policy, based on an attempt to appease various kinds of vested interests. And in a capitalist society, what that means is that you end up getting lots of law and regulation and policy that actually promotes the interests of capitalists, of big business, and of powerful and wealthy individuals who are able to lobby inside government to get what they want, basically. And even outside of politics, so within the market, these markets are very often dominated by large, powerful corporations that aren't actually subject to these pressures of market competition that I was talking about. So, a massive company like Amazon, all the big tech companies. I list loads of examples in the book, from Boeing to big agrochemical companies to pharmaceutical companies to financial institutions. Most of these kind of, important markets within capitalist societies are basically dominated by one or two very large and powerful firms. And in that sense, they aren't really competitive. They have a certain amount of monopoly or oligopoly power. And that effectively means that those firms are able to kind of do what they want, not completely whatever they want, but they have a significant amount of freedom outside of what you would expect in a kind of free market system. In a free market system, you as a producer don't really have very much freedom. The market tells you how much to produce and at what price you need to sell your good. But if you are a monopoly, you're able to kind of make bigger decisions about, production, about, your suppliers, about the way you run your business, about the way you treat your workers, because those workers don't have many other options in terms of other places to work, because your consumers don't really have many other options in terms of where to buy the thing that you're selling. And what kind of feeds into this is obviously the fact that those big corporations are able to work with states to make sure that regulation and policy reinforces their interests. So what you get, as I said, is this kind of fusion of public and private power in service of the interests of the top. And I use one example of that is, of course, Amazon. Now, Amazon is this giant multinational corporation that is both a kind of a company that produces various goods and services, and is also a kind of marketplace in itself. In terms of, it being a market in which people can go on and sell things. And it's used that power to really kind of expand and embed its own market power and its own corporate sovereignty. So, the whole strategy of Amazon has been to basically offer very, very low prices, and in doing so, expand into various different areas of the economy. So it went from books and music and those sorts of things through to what we have today, which is Amazon selling loads of different kind of items on the Amazon website, and also offering cloud computing services, offering, tons of different kinds of tech services, and dominating many of those markets in a way that makes it very difficult for other entrants to compete. So it has a huge amount of market power. It's also built a kind of parallel infrastructure, a parallel logistics infrastructure to kind of the public logistics infrastructures and even private infrastructures that we have had up until now. And that also gives it an immense amount of power over, the way that the economy works. It employs a vast number of workers in various different areas of its supply chain, logistics, etc. And in many places, Amazon is the biggest employer by a very, very long way. And in that sense, Amazon is able to kind of set wages, set conditions, because workers don't have anywhere else to go. Often Amazon has been able to exploit its market power to demand tax breaks, subsidies, special treatment from particularly local and municipal governments, as well as from national governments as well. So it's exploited its market power in that sense. It avoids tax, and it does so by basically playing different countries, different regions off against each other, saying we want lower taxes, so you have to give it to us or we'll go and move somewhere else. Really significantly, Amazon is a big political donor. And Jeff Bezos obviously owns the Washington Post and uses that power over the media to, promote his interests. So this company is a sprawling, massive multinational corporation that has vast amounts of control over the goods that we're able to purchase, the prices that we see in our economy, tax rates, what's going on with the climate because of its environmental impact, wages because of its power over workers, regulation, all of these different sorts of things. And yet it has zero accountability. There is no way for you as a consumer to demand different stuff from Amazon. And equally, there is not a very significant way for you as a citizen to demand that the government regulates Amazon more effectively, because what the government is doing is acting in Amazon's interests often. Equally, as a worker, it's very hard for you to demand higher wages or better conditions because of the significant amount of power that Amazon has in the economy, and also because it operates a very strict anti-union policy. So it makes it very, very difficult for workers to organize within Amazon. So there's no real accountability for this massive corporation, despite the fact that it has huge influence over so many areas of our lives. Now, that isn't really a free market system. That isn't really freedom in many ways. And we live in free market democracies. We're supposed to have, as citizens, the power to influence the way that our societies work, that our governments work. We're supposed to be able to influence the direction of policy and tax rates and, make our political preferences known. But because so many of our governments have been, to a greater or lesser extent, captured by the interests of powerful corporations, instead you get this kind of capitalist oligarchy where effectively all of the large political and economic institutions that exist are insulated from popular pressure, insulated from democratic accountability. And they're able to basically do whatever they want and just kind of get away with it.
And I mean, of course, all of this doesn't really fit any orthodox economics textbook, but do you think that there is a fraction within the capitalist bloc that has already moved on from this classical liberal narrative, so to speak, in order to actually emphasize this idea of capitalist planning, a fraction that actually very much identifies with it as an kind of ideological project, but also, of course, a project of power, so to speak, of economic power, but also political power, no?
Absolutely. I think that's a really, really good point. In many ways, the kind of critique that I'm identifying now is much less powerful than it would have been around the 1980s, when there was this the ideology of capitalism was based on this language of freedom. The whole transition that we had in the 1980s was how it was a project, really, amongst a certain section of capital and a certain section of intellectuals, as to how we deconstruct social democracy as it existed in the wake of the Second World War. So, we had governments that were working alongside labor unions and businesses in this kind of corporatist model of planning to, kind of contain the ups and downs of the market, to kind of contain inequality, to regulate finance, basically to kind of promote a kind of Keynesian approach to economic management that balanced different interests in the economy and therefore gave workers in the global north significantly more power. Now, the whole neoliberal project was about how do we undermine that worker power and how do we restore the power to plan to capital and make sure that the state operates in the interests of capital. And the way that was achieved was through this ideology and this language of freedom. Now, obviously we can see now that project was never anything to do with freedom. Well, it was about freedom for a certain subset of people. It was about, augmenting the freedom of capital whilst actually constraining the freedom of everyone else, constraining the freedom of citizens and of workers. Because, as a person living in this economy, you can be told, oh, you're free to work wherever you want, you're free to consume whatever you want. But actually, the labor market is dominated by a few powerful corporations. You're much less able to unionize. And even when you go into the shops, all of the goods that you have to choose from are basically owned by like 5 massive corporations. So in a lot of ways, your freedom is much more limited. And it has been, really since the 1980s as a result of all those policies that were brought in. But when you look at it now from the perspective, that we're able to look back and see how that project actually panned out, we can see it was never really about freedom. It was about reasserting capital's power to plan. And that, has now become, I think, quite obvious to the extent that this justification for capitalism that was used then of it will make you more free is no longer as effective. It was effective back then because during the kind of post-war period, there was this kind of centralized approach to the management of social democratic economies. And, it was this kind of quite rigid top-down approach to kind of Keynesian economic management that did alienate a lot of people. So, this critique that, we needed to respect personal freedom came from the right, but it also came internally from within the left as well in kind of 68 as well. So this, this ideology of freedom was really effective then. Now that kind of the idea that, capitalism will make you more free, people already feel very free. In fact, I would say, Sartre said anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. Lots of people probably feel too free. There are, you can be whatever you want, you can do whatever you want. And if you fail, that's because you're a failure. That was the whole idea of free market competition, within the labor market. It reveals who is intelligent and, effective and hardworking. And if you don't achieve the things that you could achieve, then you're basically a failure and a loser. So that kind of freedom, that freedom to compete, has actually created a lot of really significant problems within our society. Now, the most effective register, the most effective discourse that the capitalist class is using to cement its interests is not a discourse about freedom or about free markets or about efficiency or any of those things. It's actually a discourse of protection, which is ironic because the things that the Trumps and Johnsons and, even centrist politicians of this world are saying that they are going to protect people from are things that have been caused by a capitalist system that they want to kind of recreate. So, the classic example is the example of migration, right? So in the UK, it is as a result of austerity, as a result of, you know, the failure of decades of neoliberal political management. Inequality is very high. Public services are collapsing. We have a massive housing crisis. And, you know, that can all be traced back to policy decisions that have been made by governments to basically augment the interests of the wealthy and powerful and compromise the interests of those at the bottom. But the strategy of the right in this context has been to shift their discourse away from freedom and efficiency and capitalism is good towards basically saying blame immigrants, blame, you know, poor people who are on benefits, blame another marginalized social group for these problems, and we will protect you from that marginalized social group. So it's really kind of activating people's fear of the other to explain their sense of deprivation and to explain their kind of anger and disillusionment at a system that oppresses them by saying, oh, this isn't the fault of the people at the top. This is the fault of migrants and, you know, benefits claimants and whatever. And you can see this transition that's taken place within the Conservative Party in the UK, the Republicans in the US. They've gone from being quite liberal cheerleaders for capitalism and saying, you know, we want to cut taxes, cut regulation, create an environment for entrepreneurship, boost competition, which was very much the theme of the 90s and noughties, towards this very populist, often kind of anti-market strategy of saying, you know, protectionism, tariffs, border walls, cut down on migration, introduced harsh kind of disciplinary tactics against people who are out of work or who break the law or whatever. And that transition has been, this transition from a discourse around freedom and entrepreneurship and efficiency to one basically of kind of protection and othering. But it's been really fascinating to watch that transition take place because the same parties who gave us all the problems that we now have really successfully switched to say, we are the solution and vote for us because we'll protect you from these things.
And I think, these aspects that you described, on the one hand, of course, the fact that neoliberalism was always also about the state planning for the market in the sense of being a kind of market maker, as well as this kind of shift within the right towards a form of protectionism and therefore also a form of kind of planning of the economy as something that needs to be protected from the market, more or less. These things are, of course, true and very, very, very interesting, I think. But I think there's also another facet to it, which might be something like the likes of Peter Thiel, who kind of has a very different stance on how to think about competition and monopoly power and kind of tries to brand this idea of some form of creative monopoly, I think he calls it. So there's this kind of more radical strand, I would say, within capitalism that also thinks differently about these like crucial aspects of competition and how markets relate to competition and when competition is good and when it is bad, but in a very different way than the like mainstream conservative types of today. And then there's also, at least within academia, a certain strand that thinks about what is called then monopoly capitalism, when talking about the way in which Google, for example, kind of strives towards innovation in a very different type of way by kind of controlling other companies that are not really within Google, but within the sphere of power, so to speak, of Google, and therefore kind of also replicate different ideas of competition and planning within capitalism. So I think it's very interesting to see all these different changes in attitude towards markets. But would you say that what we are seeing is really a broad acceptance of this idea of capitalist planning? Do you think there's really like a shift going on that goes away from this traditional narrative of neoliberalism and competition within neoliberalism as the best way to go?
I think it's a really interesting point that you make there. And I think there's two things going on. There has been this move away from the kind of traditional model of the state's role as being an enforcer of competition, which was kind of, the original impetus for neoliberalism, towards, as you say, this broad acceptance of monopoly. But that has been very much an intellectual shift. It hasn't been replicated by a popular acceptance of these things. And actually, if anything, what has been fascinating is the way that the right has been able to combine this shift at the intellectual and policy level of a greater acceptance of monopoly with, when it talks to people, this populist anger towards elites and anger towards monopolies and, corporate power and globalists, right? It's been a hugely successful marriage, and it's fascinating to watch, and also fascinating to see how little that contradiction has undermined the success of the right. And it really does go to show, firstly, the way in which ideas, particularly in and around academia and policy making, reflect vested interests, and the ideas of the time tend to be the ideas of, the most powerful people within a society. But also, it's a great example of the kind of double speak that underpins ruling class ideology. Hayek talked about this when he was talking about the neoliberal project. He was like, we're going to need to tell people this is about freedom and a small state, but it's not actually going to mean like necessarily less state power. We're still going to need the state to do things. We just need the state to do our things. But we're going to tell people that this is about freedom and democracy and et cetera, et cetera. So there's always been that disparity between what these people are saying and what they're actually doing. And here, I think that's very, very clear. As I said, that divide between the popular, rage that someone like Trump channels, and that is a rage towards massive corporations that have undermined labor rights, hollowed out places and high streets, avoid taxes, this kind of anti-elitist, anti-globalist rhetoric. And then the actual project of the people involved in this movement, which is about augmenting the power of those very corporations. And the intellectual underpinnings of this, as you've mentioned, have been this move towards the acceptance of monopoly power. Now, to an extent, that's always been a feature of neoliberalism, particularly in the US. There was obviously this split between the kind of, European ordo-liberals and then the US neoliberals, with the ordo-liberals and the kind of framework of the European Union much more focused on ensuring effective competition. Whereas the US, the focus was always, the sole responsibility of a corporation is to maximize its profits. Government failure is always going to be more significant than market failure. So the government needs to step back and let, the market do its thing. And if that means that monopolies emerge, that's fine. A large monopoly is going to be a more effective manager of production than a government seeking to regulate that monopoly. So we'll just, leave it to do its thing. And now you're seeing that taken even further with this idea that monopoly power is actually either benign or a good thing. And I talk a little bit about the work of Schumpeter in my book. Schumpeter was probably the first mainstream economists to try and facilitate more of an acceptance of monopoly power. And he basically said that, any entrepreneur is only going to start a business if they believe they're going to get supernormal profits. And the only way to get supernormal profits is to have some form of market power. So you need temporary market power if you're going to encourage innovation. You need to allow entrepreneurs to be able to kind of have a significant reward for their efforts if they're going to do anything that will actually lead to innovation. And today you see that taken to the next level, which is to say that, the Googles, the big tech companies, the big pharmaceutical companies, whatever, need to basically be given massive monopolies or have their market power completely protected if they're going to undertake any innovation. You look at this, for example, in intellectual property rules, which have become just astonishingly permissive. You're saying, pharmaceutical companies need to have 100, extremely long leases on their intellectual property rights if they're going to do any, investigation into new drugs or whatever. So we need monopoly if we're going to facilitate innovation, because monopoly generates profits, and profits are the reward for innovation. And I think this is all based on the Schumpeterian ideology, was basically that entrepreneurs are really effective. They're the most intelligent people within society. They are the best people to make decisions about production. They're kind of like, inherently superior. And workers are lazy, boring, stupid. They don't know what they're doing. They can't be trusted to plan anything. And this kind of libertarian capitalist ideology that we see at the moment that's justifying monopoly is basically an ideology that, like, the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezoses of this world are brilliant, superhuman, super intelligent individuals who deserve the right to basically create the world in which the rest of us are living, because they're so smart, they're so brilliant, they're so capable. They should have all of this power, and that their power is going to make all of our lives better. Now, you can see what a massive shift that is from the 1980s ideology of, actually free markets are going to protect us from the concentrations of power in society that you see under social democratic systems. We're now moving towards, no, actually, we just need to give power to these really, smart, intelligent, brilliant individuals, because that's going to make life better for all of the rest of us. And firstly, that obviously isn't true. Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk are using their power to compete with each other over who can get to Mars first, rather than actually dealing with issues that are affecting the vast majority of people. Like, how do we deal with climate change? How do we, create technologies that allow us to deal with humanity's biggest challenges, like antibiotic resistance, pollinator decline, all these things that we have to deal with are technological issues. And instead our resources are being diverted to this, basically egomaniacal space race between a bunch of different billionaires. So they're not using their power in everyone else's interests. They're using their power in their own interests. But also there is this other kind of, I suppose kind of moral or ethical question about human dignity and autonomy, and to what extent you can really count yourself as free if you live in a society dominated by a bunch of billionaires. And I think that's actually a critique that the left needs to become more comfortable with, which is, the fight against capitalism and the fight against the domination of society by these huge, powerful billionaires and big monopolistic corporations is a fight for human freedom and dignity and autonomy. It's almost taking back that neoliberal critique of social democracy and throwing it back against the right and saying your system undermines people's freedom, it undermines people's autonomy, and it also screws up the planet and makes life worse for everyone.
Yes, I absolutely love that. I definitely think that the left should go for a form of we can do freedom better because it's actually true. But there's an aspect when reading your book, which was kind of funny, because I think it's because of the way in which you structure your argument against this monopoly power and kind of showing how this is contra the narrative of classical liberalism and how it is a form of doublespeak and so forth and so on. But what is kind of funny is that with some sentences, I had the feeling as if they could equally resonate with a form of like a person who is a market libertarian who argues that capitalism has been corrupted by political interests and monopoly power, and that we need to get back to the real liberalism, that we need to kind of bring back true competition in order to save capitalism, and that we basically need to make liberalism true again or something like that, So, and I know that this is absolutely not your point, but it made me want to ask, what's your take on competition in a socialist political economy? Because this is still an interesting question. And when thinking about alternatives, it definitely pops up. And it's not an easy question to answer, I think.
It isn't an easy question to answer. I'll take your first part of the question to begin with, which is how does this differ from a kind of market libertarian critique of capitalism? And basically the reason is that I kind of draw on the Marxist tradition to show that this kind of system isn't a corruption of capitalism. It is at the very core of, what a capitalist economy is and how it works. Marx talks in Volume 1 of Capital about the inherent process through which capitalism becomes centralized and concentrated. The kind of concentration and centralization of capital, i.e. that production becomes concentrated in a smaller number of larger and more powerful units. as technological change takes place. One reason for that is just economies of scale. Production is more efficient at a larger scale. But the other reason, and this relates to Marxist arguments about financialization, is that as the costs of production become higher, which tends to happen because technological change means that you need a huge amount of capital to start a viable business. So for example, if you think about like an aerospace company, if you want to start manufacturing planes, you need a lot of stuff. You need a lot of, resources that go into production before you're able to start that business. And that means that, not like it restricts competition because not everyone can get access to that. But it also deepens the linkages between capital and finance capital. Because if you're going to start a business like that, you're going to need access to, financial backing. You're going to need to be able to borrow money or raise money in capital markets. So it's inherent in the development of capitalism that you get monopoly and that you get financialization. And also, obviously, we know from Lenin, Bukharin, all of these Marxist theorists, Gramsci even, the state, that politics and economics in a capitalist society aren't separate, that, the state is a social relation just as much as capital is a social relation, and that state policy comes to reflect the balance of power within society. So, inevitably that means that you're going to get state policy operating in the interests of big finance and big business as capitalism develops. So yeah, my qualms with the kind of, market competitive libertarian outlook of like capitalism been corrupted is capitalism hasn't been corrupted. It's operating exactly as it always would have. This is kind of just the way that this system works. In terms of like the role of competition within a socialist society, it is obviously a very interesting question. And to be honest, I don't have a fully worked up answer to this question. Now, I've read a lot about, obviously like the socialist calculation debate, what a kind of market socialist approach might look like. On the other end, what a kind of democratic, decentralized approach to production might look like. So people like Pat Devine have obviously written about this. I don't think that at this point in time, either of those approaches are convincing. So I don't think full state socialism is convincing. I don't think full market socialism is convincing. And I don't think these kind of fully decentralized democratic alternatives are particularly convincing as they're worked out now. What I think we're going to end up with, is potentially some fusion of all of these different things. So you're going to need some institutions that are operating at a national level, at a state level, and that you can put in place mechanisms to make those democratic. You're not going to be able to fully centralize everything though. So there are going to be areas of the economy that are still subject to markets. And there are also going to need to be mechanisms put in place to facilitate participation in political and economic decision making. Now, the reason that I don't have a fully worked out view on this, and I don't think you need to have a fully worked out view on this, is because social change is evolutionary and it depends upon power dynamics. So, the liberals who were theorizing capitalism under feudalism didn't know what that system was going to end up looking like, but they didn't have to. They had to know what they were proposing that would shift power dynamics in such a way as to facilitate the emergence of a new kind of society. Because ultimately, that the processes and the institutions that govern that society are going to emerge from a shift in power dynamics, not the other way around, really. Obviously, it's reinforcing. But ultimately, if you figure out ways of democratizing production, of putting power in the hands of workers, that's going to create an iterative, evolutionary shift towards a different kind of system, if you're able to kind of keep it going. And what I mean by that is to say, I know where we are now, and with the kind of economic and political system we have now, we know the changes that we need to make that more democratic and to shift the balance of power to give workers more control. And I list a bunch of those in the book. They are, democratizing the state, decentralizing power within politics, kind of creating mechanisms through which popular voice can be exercised within democratic institutions, again, to kind of push back against the dominance of capital within our political institutions. They are kind of, creating more democratic public forms of production within the economic realm. So having, shifting towards like worker ownership, democratic governance of many large corporations, doing that within public services as well. So, and kind of state-owned institutions having like worker-owned, worker-governed, citizen-led public services and public companies, doing the same thing within financial institutions, having kind of democratic decision-making in things like national investment banks, national wealth funds. It's basically kind of pushing popular power into various different areas of, of the economy and society. And how do you do that? Well, it's obviously by building popular power. It's by building a movement. And the way that the decisions that are made through those democratic processes are going to determine what the kind of trajectory of that economic and political system is. And my instinct is to say that once you start giving people power, once you start unleashing democracy, once you start unleashing worker power, the trajectory will be for that to kind of embed and deepen and spread across different areas of society. Now, I don't know what that system would look like in 100 years, in 1,000 years, not least because the trajectory of technological change would also start to shift. Marx has this argument, obviously, in the Grundrisse about how, capitalism is this incredible system of technological transformation and development where technological change becomes a business in itself. And therefore, the direction of technological change becomes determined by the interests of capital. Now, when you start shifting that and taking innovation and technological transformation out of kind of capitalist power relations and giving the power over technological change to workers, to citizens, then suddenly you start seeing very different decisions being made about innovation. And do we then get to a point where, for example, we're able to develop a set of technologies that facilitates democratic planning at scale? Maybe. We don't know because we don't live in that system yet, right? So all of the things that currently seem to be predetermined, things like the direction of technological innovation, because it's so controlled by capital, start to shift as soon as you move away from that system. And because of that, it's very difficult to say what a future perfect socialist society would look like. And because of that, I'm so reticent to start speculating as to what the institutions would be that would underpin that particular kind of society. Now, some people say that's a cop-out, but I just think it would be really naive to expect that you could, think in such a way as someone who had been living in a socialist society would be able to think, that you would be able to imagine the kinds of technological innovation, of political, economic, social innovation that would emerge in a completely different society than our own. In the same way as people pushing for capitalist transformation under feudalism would never have been able to imagine the kind of society that we live in today. It would have been so far out of their, frame of reference that it would be completely unimaginable. So I do think that we have to be comfortable with this idea of iterative, evolutionary social change that's led by shifting power dynamics, rather than simply led by having a blueprint of what a future society would look like.
Right. Okay. So no blueprints. That's totally fine with me. I nonetheless have a couple of questions, I guess. I mean, one of them would be, you very thoroughly take down the myth that markets are capitalist and free and that planning is socialist, communist, and unfree and basically centralized. So this is something you deconstruct within the book quite nicely. And you argue that the choice isn't between free markets, quote unquote, and planning, quote unquote, but whether the planning that always takes place, basically, will be democratic or not. And also in the answer you just gave, you kind of basically state we need to democratize everything, more or less. My question would then be, and I think you hinted towards this in your answer as well, when stating that not everything will be able to be centralized and therefore we will need some form of markets. And I would like to kind of dig a little bit deeper into that, because this kind of equates decentralization with the need for markets. So how do you think about markets as, let's say, quote unquote, tools within this transformation? If we are not talking about some form of future political economy that can be roughly sketched out, but about forms of transformation, how do you think about markets? And maybe I would add that you mentioned Pat Devine, and he has this distinction of market relations and market forces. So there's already also the question of, are we talking about the same thing when talking about markets? Is there a different form of, like, let's say, horizontal coordination that is then not really correctly labeled as markets, but still kind of provides some aspects of what before markets were being able to produce as a form of coordination, so to speak? So how do you think about this complex in markets?
I think that already that takes us into territory that with which we are completely unfamiliar and which we cannot begin to imagine from the perspective that we live in today, right? Because, the first and foremost, let's think about the transition, right? As you were saying, we currently live in a market society. Well, within a society that is based on a combination of a certain amount of market relations and also centralized planning by big and powerful institutions. Every society that has ever existed has been, you could place it somewhere on that spectrum between a level of centralized planning and, a certain amount of kind of decentralized coordination. And a lot of those societies since, the dawn of civilization, that coordination has taken place within one form or another of market, right? Now, a lot of societies that existed before that, that coordination took place in very, very different ways, using different forms of kind of social institutions. Anthropologists have studied what those social institutions look like in depth, although we still don't really know very much about them because, again, we didn't exist during that time. But generally speaking, within recent history, going back to kind of feudal institutions, going back to different forms of societies, you can place them all on this spectrum between some form of planning, some form of market coordination of society. As we move away, imagining that we could move away from the system in which we live now, so one based on kind of capitalist control combined with some level of market coordination, I don't think it's feasible to imagine an immediate shift towards either total centralization or total marketization or some third form of non-market coordination. I think we have to look at change, as I've said, kind of iteratively. So what would facilitate within the institutions that we have now a move towards greater levels of popular control, collective organizing, democratic planning and participation? Now, what that means in reality is democratizing the existing institutions that we have today. If you're talking about a completely revolutionary system in which we remove all of the institutions that we have now somehow and start building new institutions from the ground up, that's a very different vision of social change than the one that I have and the one that I lay out in the book. And it's a perfectly legitimate one to have. You need to be able to say what the revolutionary agent is going to be, how that revolutionary change is going to happen, and then what those new institutions that you're going to be building will be in the wake of that revolution. But if you don't have that view of kind of purely revolutionary overnight social change in which all the institutions that we exist today are burned down to create space for new ones, and you have this iterative model of social change, then again, you don't need to say what the new perfect model is going to be, because you're talking about reforms within the system today and you're talking about the directionality of those reforms. So it's like, how do we change political institutions to make them more responsive to popular power and popular pressure? How do we change economic institutions to, facilitate worker control, democratic planning, citizen engagement, etc.? I don't think you need to say what, after hundreds and hundreds of years of that process of iterative social change towards greater democracy, what that system is going to look like, because I don't think it's possible to know. Like, so much of the way our society works today is a function of the kinds of technologies that we have available to us. And I really do think that this question of technological change under socialism or under a kind of, transitionary socialist society is a really important one. Just look at, for example, Allende in Chile, attempting this new model of democratic socialist planning using nothing other than a bunch of telex machines that were available in, from the Chilean army, basically. that experiment would have gone extremely differently if there had been a process of, iterative social transformation where technological change had been influenced by democratic popular pressure to go in a completely different direction. You would have totally different forms of technology that would have facilitated a kind of democratic planning that potentially would have facilitated a kind of economic planning that is unimaginable to us today, because we don't have those kinds of, technologies. And those technologies influence the way that we think about the world. They influence what is imagined as possible. They influence how we see ourselves, how we see our relationships to one another. So I think any attempt to create a blueprint for a future society, which is, I think, what many of those books about non-market coordination do, suffer from the fact that they don't know the context within which they're going to be working. They don't know what technologies are going to have been developed. They don't know what forms of, political organizing are going to have developed. They don't know what the preferences are going to be of the people in charge of those decision-making processes after several decades of political and economic transformation. I also think that they completely miss the point of what's important, because what is standing in the way of socialist transformation today is not that we don't have a blueprint for what a socialist society is going to look like. It's not that we don't have enough ideas, even about policies that we could introduce today. It is that the vast majority of people are so disengaged, apathetic, and disempowered, or just deeply angry at an economic and political system that has failed them, that they have zero interest in getting involved in any form of political and social organizing, which means that we don't have a base from which to facilitate political and economic change. And if we don't have a base from which to facilitate political and economic change, and we just have ideas and this kind of floating class of intellectuals coming up with lots of different ideas, we have nothing. You can kind of come up with ideas all day, but if you don't have a capacity to kind of, stoke, to kind of channel popular discontent into organizing, you don't have really anything. So this is why, the book is much less focused on saying what, some future perfect socialist society is going to look like, which firstly, I don't think we can say now, but it's also not really the point. The point is, how do we shed light on the contradictions of capitalism today, the way in which the way we organize society is making people's lives worse, and channel that anger into a sense of hope and empowerment that can encourage people to get involved in political change and in political organizing in such a way that we can begin to organize within all of these institutions, to begin to shift power, to then begin to actually implement different policies. And that process from organizing to power within institutions to changing policy is realistically one that's going to take a very long time as it is, because so many people are so disengaged with politics, and either they're disengaged with politics or they're buying lines from, Trump and people on the right, which are to say, don't get involved in political organizing to change society for the better. If anything, just get involved in kind of riots to attack migrants because they're the ones that are fundamentally opposed to your interests. So I really think it's really important that we ground everything we're doing and saying in an analysis of the way that society is, with a view to how we would transform that society. So with a very clear vision of how we believe people should organize with one another, what we, the kind of ethical principles according to which we believe a good society would operate. But never being right, okay, let's spend all our time figuring out what that would look like. And really actually saying, what are the problems that we face right now in building a socialist project, and how do we deal with them?
Okay, so a lot to say, of course, about that. I think it's not either or. So I'm personally of the opinion that both is needed. I mean, of course, building movement power is the absolute essential to everything. Nothing will come of nothing. So we will have to have movement power. Of course, I think there's still some merit in also engaging in a form of pragmatic utopianism, so to speak, thinking about real utopias. And I also think that it's not, if we think about alternative ways of social coordination and organization, it does not necessarily mean that one would want to provide a blueprint of some sorts. But if we think about, for example, non-market ways of coordinating, then this could also be kind of collapsed into forms of prefigurative politics, as, for example, is the case within commons. You know, we talk about commons and commoning, and this is a form of non-market coordination as well, which does not subscribe to any form of blueprint of any sort, but is still kind of thinking in the here and now about non-market ways of coordination in a very prefigurative sense that tries to make lives better in the here and now. So I don't think that this is a necessarily
I agree with that, actually. As long as I totally, and actually I write in the book, the whole last section of the book is examples of democratic planning that are taking place today.
Yes.
I guess what I was picking up on is this question of, like, you know, the kind of Eric Olin Wright versus Pat Devine and others books, which have been all about, like, if we're imagining mathematically how we would work out some form of like non-market coordination, what would that look like? I find that quite alienating. But I totally agree with you that we need to focus on prefiguring what kind of, you know, different forms of social organization, social coordination would look like. Obviously, the critique you then get is, well, you know, you can have participatory budgeting or worker-controlled organizations within a capitalist society, but they rely on wider capitalist social relations. How do you then, you know, figure out how a whole society would be arranged upon these principles? And I guess what I'm saying is you don't necessarily need to start out with an answer to that second question, but I totally agree with you. It's super, super important to shed light on those examples of kind of democratic planning and non-market forms of coordination that we have today. And I actually do that, as I said, in part 3 of the book.
Yes, absolutely. I would like to kind of dig a little bit deeper into this question of transformation. You already sketched like the general way in which you approach this question, that it needs to be iterative, which I really like, that it needs to be, in the sense, processual. I very much agree with all of this, but I have like huge question marks when it comes to the role of organized capital vis-a-vis this type of gradual transformation. Because, I mean, we have a society in which we are being dominated by capital. It's very powerfully organized and has certain tools like capital strike, you mentioned in the book, capital flight as well. But also, and we will have to mention that specifically when talking, for example, about Chile, which you mentioned, also types of military interventions, military operations, and so on. So if we think about this transformation in this gradual sense of kind of also undermining the power of capital, the power of investment as being enacted through capital, kind of undermining this power bit by bit, it's fair to assume that capital won't sit by idly and just simply watch us trying to take their power like one democratization after the other. So there will be some form of not only tension, but probably fight. So how do we deal with this fact?
Yeah, I mean, we've already obviously seen this very, very clearly in recent years. I was pretty tightly involved in the Corbyn project and in organizing around that. And I'm sure that listeners will also be familiar with the various other forms of post-crisis socialist political movements that were attempted and generally failed in recent years. Now, part of the reasons for those failures were internal. They were to do with kind of failures of organizing. They were to do with failures of leadership. They were to do with the absence of actually a powerful base and block upon which a political project could then be mounted almost. You know, I know certainly in the UK, we'd had, after several decades of the defeat of various forms of collective movement, whether that was kind of, you know, anti-trade union laws kind of restricting demonstration, the kind of triumph of individualism that dramatically curtailed any form of political organizing. We then suddenly had this big shift towards Corbynism, and almost had to like retrofit movements behind that could then exist to defend the project. And you see this in, for example, much more in like, let's say, Latin American politics, where you have political leaders that are elected on the like based on a foundation of popular political organizing, and the extent to which those leaders succeed is often kind of it is always shaped by the coherence and power of those popular movements and the extent to which they're able to push back against the countervailing power that's exerted by capital. But in the global north, we just haven't really had that, as I've said, because of the defeat of all of those political movements that we did have. And also because, as I've said, you know, I think, to be honest, the big factor is the triumph of kind of neoliberal individualism that has just, it has made the very idea of collective organizing completely inconceivable to the vast majority of people. That is, I think, the biggest challenge, actually. Because if you have powerful political movements that are capable of resisting the power of capital, as we've seen in moments throughout history, for example, the 1970s, when you've had powerful trade unions, powerful, popular movements that have been capable of organizing in their communities, on the streets, etc., then it has been much more possible to imagine not only resisting, but actually actively pushing back against capital, particularly in global north countries, where those threats of both military intervention and kind of economic sanction are less significant, because, you know, there is a certain base that you're able to organize from in terms of like the physical infrastructure and the availability of resources within that country. Today, the biggest thing that kind of militates against that is, as I said, the fact that most people can't even imagine what it would be like to get involved in a collective movement of any kind. That is really the triumph, more than the kind of actual takeover of the state. That is the real triumph of neoliberalism, has been this transformation of society. It is really astonishing when you talk particularly to young people. I do this all the time. I go out and talk to them and I say, 50 years ago, if we'd had a cost of living crisis, which we did, people would have come together in their workplaces and said, can you afford to put food on the table? Because I can't. What should we do about it? And then they maybe would have organized, gone on strike, demanded higher wages from their boss. Whereas today, if you can't afford to make ends meet, you blame yourself, you take out a high interest payday loan, you compete harder, faster, more intensely at work in order to potentially win higher wages or a promotion for you yourself as an individual. The idea that there is another way of fighting back against your own impoverishment and marginalization, and that comes through collective organizing. It's just completely alien to anyone who was born in a world after the 1980s, basically. And that was very much a feature of the neoliberal turn. It was, obviously there was the fact of destroying the trade union movement, the fact of making it harder to demonstrate, the fact of destroying bases of left popular power in municipal government, whatever. But it was also a massive ideological shift of centering competition in all areas of social life, even if big corporations were actually protected from that competition. But competition became an ideal and a fact of social life. To the extent that it became difficult to imagine what cooperation in social life could look like. And that, I think, is a massive shift to begin to, it's a massive shift that we need to really be able to start to create in people's thinking about the world. Because if your whole life is grounded in this idea of society, which is basically the strong and intelligent rise to the top, the weak and the useless fall to the bottom. It is entirely up to you to protect yourself and your family against any risks that may accrue to you over the course of your life. And that the way that you do that is by pushing other people out of the way to get what you want. It's by investing in yourself, in your human capital, to make yourself a more effective cog in this big capitalist machine. It's by investing in, effective ways to protect yourself against life's ups and downs, accruing little pots of capital in your house, in your pension, to make sure that, you have kind of invested responsibly, that you're effective entrepreneur of the self, that you've developed an effective personal brand that allows you to succeed in life. All of these ways of thinking about existence are fundamentally alien to any form of collective social organization, and they need to be unlearned if we're going to get people involved in political organizing. And the reason that I say this in answer to your question is because the only way that we would be able to kind of mount an effective fight against capital is if we were able to build these forms of popular organization and popular movements that could mount that resistance. So yes, within the labor movement and the trade union movement, and even explaining to young people what a trade union is like, it's project number one for anyone involved in movement organizing. If you ask the vast majority, especially in the UK and maybe in parts of the US, of young people under 25, like, what is a union? They won't be able to tell you. If you ask them what is a co-op, they won't be able to tell you. Like, they literally do not know what these things are or how they could get involved in it. And this is what I mean when I say, like, we have to begin our questions around organizing with the world in which we find ourselves. Like, if you're not out there talking to people who are existing in the kind of society that we live in today, it can be easy to underestimate the scale of the challenge. But it is huge. The biggest accounts on things like TikTok and Instagram, some of the biggest accounts are things like how to create a passive income, which is like, how can you buy up loads of different properties and then live off the rent? It's like, Andrew Tate and these kind of right-wing male influencers that are basically how to accumulate stuff in order to make yourself seem like a high status individual. Like, how to, like, even people like Jordan Peterson. It's like, how do you implement habits that make you a more effective and productive human being so that you can succeed in life and protect yourself? All of these, like, these are some of the biggest selling books today. These are some of the biggest influencers today. And they're all teaching our entire society highly individualistic ways of being that militate against any form of collective organizing. And that collective organizing is the foundation of any transformation towards socialism. So I say, the problem is even before we start to get resistance from capital, the problem is, how do we even get people to think about responding to their problems, not through self-exploitation, but through collective organizing? And that requires a massive shift. It requires us all to be out there in the world, talking to people in our communities, in our workplaces and on the streets, and saying there is another way.
Wonderful. Grace, there's a last question that I ask all of my guests, and it goes, if you think about the future, what makes you joyful?
So this is a great question. Honestly, having just said all of that about how young people are really individualistic and it's really hard to get through to them, I've had some amazing light bulb moments with young people just talking about this stuff, where I'm like, you think about the world as you against the world, you competing with other people, you making yourself more productive, more efficient, learning better ways to exploit yourself. There is this whole other way of looking at life, which is about how you cooperate with other people more effectively, how you organize yourself into, collective groups that can fight for your interests together, how you build community, how you build solidarity, how you share risk and how you share success, what that looks like, how that would help us fight back against climate breakdown, against, inequality, against all these different things. And it's almost like they've literally never thought that would be a possibility. And so as soon as you bring it up with them, it's like the scales fall. And it's like, oh, there is this whole other way of organizing society. And it cuts through that neoliberal ideology so effectively just to even bring that up, that it's almost like, that neoliberal ideology, it's pervasive. And because it's pervasive, it's very strong, but it's actually very thin. And I think as socialists, we are at a position and at a point in time where it's so obvious that capitalism is so fucked that we have a real opportunity to slice through that like layer of neoliberal conditioning and ideology and bring forth, as you were saying, you know, these prefigurative political formations. And that by participating in those political formations, you start to see transformation on an individual and social level that is really radical. You know, in some of the like the examples of democratic planning I look at in the book, where you see people doing like community land trusts or getting involved in participatory budgeting or taking control of their company, like just participating in a movement like that, even if it fails, it transforms the person's orientation towards other people. It transforms the way they understand society. It really kind of kicks that like individualism to the curb in a way that I don't think can ever be recovered. Now, that isn't to say that that then means that they turn into complete perfect socialists. Sometimes they become deeply disillusioned and just think we're all fucked and there's no way of changing things. But I think like the process of like cracking through that ideological conditioning is one that is potentially easier than we think it would be because it doesn't run that deep. It's just, you know, very pervasive, is like a real form of hope. And like every single person that just responds to the call and gets involved in any form of political organizing, however basic, I think is a massive victory for the left. And I think it's also something that a lot of people, particularly young people in our society, are crying out for. You know, they're anxious, they're depressed because they feel so alone. They're like, everything that happens to me in my life is on me. If I fail, it's all on me. No wonder there are these epidemics of kind of mental health and anxiousness. People are crying out for a sense of belonging, community, solidarity, all things that participating in organizing can provide them with. And if we as socialists can kind of open the door to that process for people, I think it can create this momentum that will be unstoppable over the long run.
Wonderful. Grace, thank you so much for being part of Future Histories.
Thank you for having me. It's been great to be here.
That was our show for today. Thanks a lot for listening. If you want to support Future Histories, you can do so on Patreon. For this, visit patreon.com/futurehistories, or you can simply tell a friend that you liked the show and that he, she, or they might like it as well. Thanks a lot, and hear you in 2 weeks.